Hey, my name is Andrew Kaplan, and you're in the middle of listening to a 7-part mini-series going behind the scenes with the Navattic growth team. We explored all kinds of things that typically don't get shared publicly in the growth community. We talked about how they think about growth, how they set their strategy, their operating system, what they track, what they don't track, how often they share internally to drive alignment, and we talked about some of their biggest challenges, their fears, and their speed bumps along the way. Let's jump back in where we left off. So I'm curious, we can get into some of the individual projects and experiments, but I'm curious if we could take a step back and talk about what are y'all focused on right now and why are you focused on those things and how did you get buy-in to work on those things?
Yeah, I think at a super high level right now, one thing we're just thinking about is like, how can we make buying Navattic easier? And even for an individual end user, like how can you do it in a way where maybe you can avoid a little bit of, CFO, CEO scrutiny? Like one thing we're hearing a lot in the market is, I really like this, but I don't have budget. I don't have approval. So we are thinking about maybe PLG-ish, maybe just making it easier. Like what are ways that we can help the end user ultimately who's excited about Navattic get it without having to go through the million rounds of every time you buy software, okay, scrutinize.
Yep. So PLG makes sense to be part of it. I'm curious, are there 2 or 3 main pillars that you're focused on? And if so, what are they?
I'd say 2 main things. So from more bottom funnel, buying Navattic, again, making it as simple as possible. How can we make it more self-serve, painless experience? And then also more top of funnel, a pillar we're focusing on. I feel like we have a lot of people who know about Navattic. It's like an awareness, which is awesome. A lot of website visitors, as we quoted before, but then how do we get more of those engaged in the website and then also like booking a demo? So both, I'd say that like awareness to in-funnel phase and then in-funnel to buying phase. So just like the whole funnel.
Just the whole thing.
All of it.
Well, yeah, that's why I was curious if there was 2 areas that you were focused on. I heard this thing from someone who's way more successful than I am, which is you really can't do more than 2 things at any given time. And then if you do, probably you're doing a bunch of littler things, but I was curious if there was big things for y'all. So it sounds like you're focused a little bit on top of funnel, focused a little bit on increasing conversion, lower in the funnel. Are there specific KPIs that you have that are like part of those goals?
I think big thing is like the book a demo to, or book a demo page to book a demo conversion. So just general website conversion rate. Like I feel like we got a good amount of, again, eyeballs on the website. Obviously we always want more, but less concerned about that. Really improving that website conversion rate. And then I think it would actually be MQL to operate. So how many people who take that first meeting go into our funnel? And that's not really that step where it's like, hey, I might think this is cool, but I don't really want to go through the process of like getting buy-in.
Yeah. And to focus on those things, is there like, what is the approval process like at Navattic? So I assume that you sit down, I'm going to make some assumptions. So probably you sit down with input from you and determine where it is that you want to focus. And you start to brainstorm ideas and start to figure out what would we need to execute on those ideas. But at some point along the line, usually there's some checks and balances with the executives and the senior folks. Can you share a little bit about what that process is like? And if there's any back and forth, what happens?
Yeah, I'd say we do use the OKR system roughly. So what I'll do, like a few weeks ago, I sat down with my CEO, who's like the ultimate kind of checks and balances, and said, hey, like those points in the funnel, this is what I'm thinking that we need to focus on for next quarter. Do you agree generally? Yes, no. Here are some ways I'm thinking about solving it.
So you do this in like a one-on-one, in like a pre-meeting, like tell us a little bit more specifics if you can.
So we do it in a one-on-one, and I'll honestly I'll do it pretty casually at first, just be like, hey, here's what I'm thinking about OKRs. How does that align? But then we do generally have team leads meeting where we might talk about, okay, this is everyone's focus area. We also have an offsite coming up. So it's funny, like we were just talking about OKRs on the train right down here. And at some degree, I'm like, here's what I'm thinking. But I also know when offsites we have twice a year, it always feels like a big new priority or focus or realignment comes out of it. So I'm also sort of lightly like, I'm putting down some ideas so we can start planning. But I think that's probably when we'll really get alignment from the entire leadership team of like, this is priority number 1 for this quarter.
Yeah. And then you can kind of revisit your goals to make sure they ladder up to those. And those could be changing, which is why you're putting them in pencil for now.
Exactly.
Yeah. Let's say you have the offsite. Well, not let's say. The offsite is coming up. Let's assume that something changes. What happens after that? let's say your priorities don't change at all. Maybe the company goals change, but still the two things that you talked about, website conversion rate and MQL to op, still make sense to focus on. Is there some kind of pitch meeting where you have to like defend the dissertation amongst the other leaders, or is it pretty straightforward? Like you develop the strategy, you give it to the, you run it by your CEO, and then in the rest of the leadership meeting, it's more just for alignment.
Yeah, what's nice about Navattic in general, I think we have a pretty good, healthy level. Everyone trusts what everyone's doing. So if we all agree on the priority and that we're all working towards it, no one's nitpicking the exact way I'm going to solve it. People trust at Navattic that we as a growth team know the best way to solve it. Obviously, people will have ideas and contribute to it, but it's not like I really have to politic and explain exactly why. It's like, they're like, okay, you're solving this thing we said was important. We trust you know how to solve it. And then that's when it goes into like the entire growth experimentation framework that Raman created.
Yeah. I want to ask one more question about this, and then we can talk about next steps. As a side note, I had Shani Benzer on my podcast. She's the CMO at Earnest, and it's like a super badass. I asked her a similar version of this question, and she says that when she creates her strategies, she spends the most amount of time getting alignment on her assumptions. She was like, if I have alignment on my hypotheses, on what I think is broken and how I'm seeing the market evolve, the ideas are almost obvious. And she said, I have very little pushback there. And I heard you share something similar. You do it a little bit more informally, but it sounds like that's what you're doing with your CEO.
Yeah, I think it's just, I want to make sure the problems we're solving are the right problems. Because to be honest, like I could pitch 7 ideas to leadership, but we work at a fast moving startup. We're going to have 20 new ideas of how to solve it. What I really care about is like, are we addressing the most important parts in the company right now? Yes, no, the actual ways to address it. Honestly, we don't even get that into it in those leadership meetings.
Okay, so we have these meetings. We have alignment on our 2 OKRs. We have our 2 KPIs. What happens after that? Because I've heard you talk a little bit about the growth process. Natalie comes out of the leadership meeting. She said, hey, we have alignment. We're going to stamp it. We're going to focus on these 2 things. Then what?
So then that's usually when we'll do like an ideation or some sort of like brainstorm across the company. And like Natalie said, really focused on problem. And then from there, we'll pull a couple experiments. We'll like add them to our backlog. We'll usually like start to scope them out. So we have a template basically for our experimentation framework where we've defined success metrics, hypotheses, how we're going to test it. From there, test it, execute on it, and then continue to iterate depending on if it is a learner or a successful experiment.
And what or how formal, if formal at all, is your roadmap? So we have our goals, we have our process that we can run a whole bunch of ideas through. You talked about ICE framework, backlog for ideas. Do you create like a formal roadmap? Like, do you know the experiments that you're going to run 3 months down the road, or is it a little bit more fluid?
It's definitely very fluid.
Yeah.
I think it even changes. Like our backlog is constantly shifting. And I think that helps us move really quickly because like I was saying earlier, we like operate really like a product team in the way we have sprints. And so we're not planning in a way like quarterly for what our experiments are. And that lets us like also, if the CEO sets a new direction or there's like a new learning or the market shifts, like we can really quickly change what our priorities are too. And that flexibility is just like built into the way we're doing our sprints. So it's really easy to reprioritize things.
And I find that's pretty common at early stage companies. At some point when the company maturity gets higher, obviously there's more rigor around planning and scoping and resource estimation and all that stuff. But in the early days, it's fun to go fast. What is the thing that you're most worried about when you think about your growth strategy and ability to deliver on the results?
I think as we're laying out this process, even I'm sitting here reflecting, and this is again kind of the ideal. The reality is that it's constantly changing. And the way we've created it, it is super flexible. Like we will swap in and out experiments sometimes in a week or 2 weeks. But sometimes I do think like, should we be just really focused and planned for a quarter? Is it okay that we're trying a bunch of different experiments in different places? And even those 2 main focuses I said at the beginning, like we delineate that sometimes if we hear a really cool idea or the CEO has, really wants to run an experiment. So I think I balance like some of the fun and the special sauce of a startup is that it's flexible. But at what point do we almost need to really adhere to our focus areas so we're not getting distracted?
Can I add my own 10 cents to this?
Yeah.
I think if you work at an early stage company, adaptability is one of the most important traits to keep your sanity, right? Because there's sometimes where having flexibility is a superpower for the 2 of you, right? You can shift direction really quickly. You're not locked into anything. you can change if there's an opportunity and go grab it. The downside of that is that you can also potentially be beholden to other people's changes. And that part doesn't feel good sometimes, especially if you're someone that isn't quite as flexible or adaptable. So I see that as one of the most common traits. And it's kind of what I'm hearing from the two of you.
Yeah. And I'd say to your point, though, about being beholden to others, I think that's where my role of like, I need to understand the why. There are very few times, and I think both of us, where we'll get an experiment that we run and we're like, oh, we're just doing this because we have to. Not saying every experiment we're so excited about, but that's where aligning on the problem, as long as we all know that we all are focusing on a problem that's really real to the company, I don't really mind if it's someone else's idea. I just need to agree to the reason of why we're doing it. So that part doesn't scare me as much.
Hey, thanks so much for listening. That's going to be it for this mini episode. As a reminder, you are in the middle of listening to a 7-part mini-series going behind the scenes with the Navattic growth team. And I would love your feedback. I'd love to hear what you think so far. If the content is interesting, if you're learning, if it's resonating, let me know. You can either tag me on LinkedIn at Andrew Kaplan, or you can tag the show at Delivering Value Podcast, or leave me a comment. The two best places would be one, either on my Substack, which is at media.deliveringvalue.co, where all of the episodes will be published, or on any of the individual episode pages on YouTube. And if you are enjoying the show, the best thank you would be a review. You know the game. Those reviews help the algorithm surface my show to other folks just like you. Thank you again for listening. On to the next episode.